you have an issue that you would like to have some kind of an answer for, ask it. I may know the answer and I may not, but if I don't know it, I'll lie about it so well you won't know the difference. But that's kind of the West Kentucky way, you know. You come out of there thinking that we're all geniuses and we didn't know at all what we were talking about the whole time. But different reasons for making splits, making nukes. One reason is swarm reduction, trying to keep hives from swarming. Swarming is reproduction at the colony level. It's a natural thing. A healthy hive with a good queen is going to swarm. That's their instinct. That their instinct for reproduction drives everything that they do. So if you split the hive using the old queen and introduce a different queen, change the pheromone in the hive by putting a new queen in there or by letting them raise their own queen, you've allowed that hive to satisfy its instinct for reproduction, the reproduction of the colony. That's a survival mechanism. Honeybees have several survival mechanisms. We don't recognize all of them as being that, but they are. And if one hive divides itself and makes 3 to 4 colonies each year, it's got a lot better chance of surviving. Not that one hive, but the species. And that's the disconnect that we have about honeybees, is that the survival instinct is never about the individual colony. The survival instinct is all about survival of the species. That's why sometimes when things go wrong in a hive that the bees cannot overcome, they'll just leave the hive. They'll abscond. They'll fly out of the hive. It doesn't matter if it's June or if it's January. If there's something in there they can't overcome, they'll leave the hive. If it's warm enough weather for them to fly, they can abscond at any time. And I see this more and more I get a lot of people that call me from our part of the country that want to know why their bees left the hive in December. Why did my bees swarm in November? Well, it wasn't a swarm. They just left the hive. And that is a survival mechanism. They're leaving what they can't overcome behind them. And the question is, well, that's stupid because they're not going to survive. Why is it a survival mechanism? It's not about the colony, it's about the species. They're leaving that behind them. Their instinct is so strong, they leave the hive, they leave their problem behind them, and it don't get passed on. I mean, that's the instinct. So instinct that's what drives everything that goes on in a honeybee colony. The instinct to swarm is all about reproduction of the colony. And when you allow them to fulfill that instinct or make them think that they have by changing the pheromone signature in the hive, you take out young brood, which removes that pheromone from the hive, and you change queens, which changes that pheromone in the hive, then they're a lot less likely to swarm. That's one reason to make splits or to make nukes. The most obvious reason is to increase your numbers. If you're having a 30% loss every winter, which if you're only having a 30% loss, you're doing really well. Because the honest number for winter losses is way more than 30%. You may read or hear that the nationwide loss is 40%. Take into account the hives that winter in Florida and California. The hives that actually winter somewhere that there's not a constant honey and pollen flow, the loss is way higher than that. So if you're only losing 30%, pat yourself on the back. But you got to make that up somehow. Split hives to make that up. The one thing to remember when you're splitting a hive, honeybees don't care about pupa. They don't care about capped brood. What holds honeybees in a hive is unsealed brood, larvae. larvae will hold bees on the frame. They'll stay in a hive with larvae. If you're making a split and you're moving frames of brood that's all capped, bees may or may not stay with it. There's nothing for them to do with capped brood. They have to feed and care for larvae. They will stay with larvae. Besides, the larva gives off juvenile pheromone / hormone, depending on what side of that fence you're on. The larva gives off a unique smell, scent, that this chemical signature that larvae have, that's different from pupa. Pupa already have body parts. Larva is a worm. It has segments. Pupa has body parts. Of course, a larva does have a head and it does have legs, but you can divide the larva by segments into thorax, abdomen, but it's not developed. Nothing is developed that far along in the larva to have glands that are secreting anything other than juvenile hormone and pheromone. So pupa already has glands that are working. It's an adult bee that just hadn't fully matured yet, and the bees understand that. It's a totally different smell, pheromone signature, and they don't pay any attention to pupa unless they're tearing the top off the cell and dragging it out because there's something wrong with it. That's the only time they really pay attention to pupa, but they will stay with larva because they've got to feed that larva and care for it. So if you're making splits, be sure that both sides of your split have larvae in it. The side that is, if you're going to leave one of them where it's catching all the foragers, that side don't have to have quite as much larvae in it because it's going to have bees. The foragers are going to come back to there. The one that's going to be moved, that needs quite a bit of larvae, a good percentage of larvae in it. Cool weather, you need to put more frames of brood in your split. If you're making a nuke or a split, put more frames of brood just for the heat. No other reason. Weather like this, you can make a split with 2 frames of bees. 2 frames that has brood and bees on it, 1 frame of food, and you're good to go. Put more frames in there. They'll be a little bit slower to build. The more brood you put in there, the faster they'll build up into a full-size colony. But if you're just wanting to make up numbers, and we're always working for what we're going to get next year. If you're making a split in the spring, unless you make it just an even split, half and half, you're probably not going to make a lot of honey from that one, from the smaller split. A 2 or 3 frame nuke in the spring may or may not make a crop of honey. It's totally dependent on your forage, on your honey flow later in the spring. But if you make 5 and 5 or bigger, depending on how big the hive is you're splitting, if you make a 5 and 5, both of them probably make a crop of honey. Of course, the one that's catching the foragers is going to have a better opportunity for it because it's already got that foraging group of bees that are bringing nectar and honey in. So I'm telling you these things just so you won't be disappointed if you make a split and then you wind up having to feed one of them later in the summer, because you might. If they don't forage enough, and if you don't have a good enough honey flow that they can get sufficient food stores, you may end up feeding that split in July or August. It's okay. I mean, look at your bees like livestock. Most beekeepers, especially those that have not been keeping bees very long or that only have a couple of hives, tend to look at their bees like pets. And that's okay, but you need to treat them like they're livestock. If you have a field full of cattle and you have dry weather and the pasture burns up, you're going to have to put hay out for those cattle in the middle of the summer. It's exactly the same thing with bees. If their pasture dries up in the summer, if where I live, we never have anything blooming in August. Anything that's blooming is not, the bees aren't going to work it. It'd be some kind of fennel or something like that they don't work at all. But if they don't already have some food in the hive, we have to feed them. And so we do. When your bees need to be fed, feed them, just like their livestock. On the varroa treatment versus non-treatment, this kind of goes right in with that. If you take your dog to get a rabies shot every year so that it won't get rabies, then the philosophy extends to your honeybees. You need to make sure they don't get sick too. Rabies is a virus. Varroa mites don't kill our bees anymore. They used to. It's what varroa mites bring into the hive and infect the hive with that kills the bees. And one virus, unless it's a particular virus, there's one or two that'll kill the bees by itself, but most viruses won't kill the bees by themselves. They depend on secondary things. It's almost like HIV. It weakens the immune system to the point that a bee's immune system is almost prehistoric. It's not very complex. It's easy to crash. So a virus weakens the immune system. Every additional thing that happens to the bees just cascades on that, and eventually your bees go under from it. So we're good at killing varroa mites. The viruses are the issue, because the viruses get into the colony through varroa mites. Then the bees themselves become the vector, because the bees are infected with the virus. It becomes systemic in the bees, and as they feed larvae, they transfer that to the larva through the food that they're producing through the hypopharyngeal gland, and the larvae have the virus. And whatever virus it is, there's close to 30 viruses that have been recognized that varroa transmit into a hive, and none of those viruses kill the larva. That's the problem. It'd be better if they kill the larva. That way the bees would remove it and it would be gone out of the hive. It has a sublethal effect. The larvae have the virus. When they become adult bees, they have that virus, then they are the vectors, and they spread that virus to the larvae they feed. So you can have a hive that don't have any varroa mites to speak of in it. You can test for varroa mites and find out that you don't really have that many in there, not enough to justify treating, but your bees just keep getting smaller, and your colony gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and that's what you're seeing, is this secondary effect. It's just a gradual lessening of the population, because the bee's lifespan is shortened by 1/3, 1/4 to 1/3. It's just a gradual lessening of the population of the colony until there's no way it's going to get through the winter. And that's one reason that they will leave the hive, that they'll abscond from the hive. When they get small enough, they look around and say, well, you know, nobody left, let's leave. Whatever is the problem, we can't even see it. We're getting out of here. And they abscond in December or November. At a time of year, there's no reason for them to leave a hive, no logical reason. But back to making splits, all that was just kind of a pitch for taking care of your bees.
Do you treat for things other than varroa as like preventative measures for nosema or anything like that?
I do not treat for nosema, but and I don't ever beat anybody up for either treating or not treating. That doesn't matter to me. They're your bees. Manage them how you would want to manage them. But I treat for varroa mites, and I treat symptoms that are vectored by varroa mites, which is a brood disease. It's a type of foul brood that's usually misidentified as European foul brood. But I treat for those two things. I don't treat for nosema because I was part of a study a few years ago that we treated and tested for nosema, and I've made enough nosema slides that I don't care if I ever make another one. But my eyes about bugged out of my head looking through microscopes, that trying to find that stuff or finding way too much of it and thinking this can't be what I'm looking at. But turns out it was. But it's effective until you quit treating. Fumagillin works until you quit using it, and then it blows up just as much or more. The population of Nosema, it would kind of go like this all the time. Sometimes it would be bigger waves, but it never spiked, and it never spiked. But when you treat them with fumagillin, it spikes down. When you quit treating with fumagillin, it spikes way higher than it was to begin with. We'd have 200,000 spores, Nosema spores, which is a fairly moderate infestation. We have 200,000 Nosema spores, and treat with fumagillin, and you go to 2,000, maybe 5,000. We think, well, this has really worked. Quit treating with fumagillin, in 2 weeks we'd have 2 million. And that's just how and taking that as a model, that's what we're seeing with varroa mites and viruses now. When we would knock down the fumagillin, when we remove that barrier, when we knock down the Nosema with fumagillin, we remove that fumagillin barrier to the Nosema surviving, took out all the other competition, you know, and Nosema just would go through the sky. But that's what the viruses have done. It don't take nearly as many mites to vector these viruses into a hive to have more viruses than we ever used to when we had a big mite population. And it's more like removing the competition. When you have a few viruses that have no competition, you know, they're not competing for food or not competing for a host, then they just blow up. And that's what's happening with viruses right now. That's why it's really important to do whatever you can to keep the lowest number of varroa in the hive that you can, and to recognize the symptoms that you got varroa issues. There's nothing you can do about these viruses once you get them, except try to keep the bees alive until they can kind of overcome it themselves. And part of that involves knocking down the varroa to the lowest possible level. If I check a hive and I find a mite, I treat them. The treatable threshold don't mean nothing anymore. I mean, it's a fantasy to think that you got to have 6 mites for 300 bees to justify treating. If you find a mite in your hive, it's like finding a mouse in your cupboard. You know, there's more than one. So do something to knock the mites down. A local beekeeper called me and asked how I thought he should treat for his mites, because he'd been using oxalic and it just wasn't working. It was not satisfying him anyway. And I told him that for oxalic to really be effective, you have to use it every other day for it to be effective enough to keep your mite population down where it won't harm your bees. And he said, well, that'll burn the bees up. I said, well, you can choose your poison, you know. Let varroa kill them, or you kill them yourself with oxalic. But so he treated with formic acid, and he called me back and he said, I got 27 mites out of 300 bees. I said, man, you hit the jackpot, didn't you? And he said, yeah, but I treated with formic. And I said, well, here's what you got to understand about formic. It does not kill the mites under the cappings. It renders them non-reproductive, but it don't kill them. So what he was seeing, he had a ton of mites under the cappings. And when he did his mite roll, that's what he found. All those mites that were under the cappings. And I'll bet that none of them would have ever reproduced. But he kind of freaked out over that, and he's still kind of, he's that sort of fellow though. He freaks out over a lot of stuff, which burns my phone minutes up. But that's what he's saying. So understanding what you're treating with and how it's going to react with the mites, formic and oxalic will kill the mites that are out in the open, phoretic mites, the ones that are on the bees, loose in the hive. Oxalic won't have any effect at all on the mites that are under the cappings. Formic acid does penetrate the cappings, and it confuses the reproductive process in the mice, and they don't reproduce. But they're not dead. It don't kill them. So knowing those things, that's why these other treatments that have to stay in the hive for 6 weeks, that's why. Because they only kill the mites that are outside the cappings too. And the mites have to finish a full life cycle, come out of the cappings, and actually 6 weeks is 2 complete mite life cycles. So brood cycles for them. So that's why you have to leave strips in, or thymol. That's why you have to leave those in for 6 weeks. But they're pretty effective as treatments. Now, if you choose non-treatment, that's up to you. But if you choose non-treatment, there's a couple of things that you're going to have to learn to do to be able to keep bees. You've got to learn how to take one hive and make 4 out of it. I mean, that is a must, because chances are you're going to lose a lot of your bees every year. You got to know how to get back to that static number that you want to have. Splitting hives is not that big of a deal. We tend to overcomplicate everything that we do with bees. We think that you got to be some kind of a professor or something to be able to do all this. Well, they're bugs. They've been doing it for thousands of years. I mean, surely we're smarter than a bug, but maybe not. But sometimes I don't feel that way. But learn how to take one hive and make 4 out of it. Now, the easiest way to make splits, and most successful way that you will make splits, is using a mated queen. Buying a mated queen or raising your own queen, and using a mated queen to make your split. 2 or 3 frames of bees with brood, frame that's got food on it, and a mated queen, and you're good to go. Everyone is not going to work, but most of them will, if that's how you make your splits. The second option is to make a walkaway split, or that you're not concerned about finding your queen. You take your hive and you divide the hive that you're wanting to split evenly into 2 boxes, making sure that both boxes have eggs, larva, pupa, and food, and bees. If both hives have that, then you don't even care where the queen is. The one that does not have a queen will make a queen. Most of the time that works. Most of the time being about 2/3 of the time. The reason it doesn't work the other third is because, and this goes across the board, if you're raising queens and letting them fly out to be naturally mated, about 1/3 of them will never come back to the hive. When a virgin queen takes her mating flight, she don't make it back to the hive. 1/3 of the time, year in, year out, 1/3 of the time. Sometimes almost all of them will. Sometimes almost none of them will. Usually it's weather. Most of the time it's wind. The virgin queen flies out of the hive and flies low to the ground until she gets to the outside perimeter of where her hive forages. She tells that by sense of smell. Their sense of smell is phenomenal. So bees tag their forage area with a nasinol pheromone. The nasinol pheromone is common in being the basic ingredients, but it's also unique from one hive to another. So the queen knows when she gets to the outside edge of her hive's foraging area, and then she flies up. Or if she reaches a barrier she can't fly through, like a really thick woods, that's when she flies up. That's one reason drone congregation areas are nearly always at a break in the landscape, like a woods line or a tree line, a creek, or there's a gap in between 2 fence rows or something. That's where your drone congregation area is going to be, because that's where the queens are going to fly up, and they mate. Problem is, there may not be much wind this high off the ground, but when she gets 80 feet off the ground, there may be a pretty good crosswind, and If she gets caught in a crosswind, she's not coming back. That's just the hazard of the business of being a queen, I suppose. Once in a while, you'll have predators that cause them not to come back. Those are the things that will cause your walk-away split not to work. Now, if you're making a walk-away split when there's nothing blooming and they're not getting any feed and the bees are not happy about being bees at that time and they're really not happy about you being a beekeeper, it's probably not going to work. The time to split bees is when they're wanting to do it themselves. When there's a good honey flow on, that's when they're going to be easiest to split, and that's when you're going to be most successful making your splits. And the climate here is probably not much different than where I live. I live almost to the Mississippi River, right along the Kentucky-Tennessee state line. So I would bet that your climate's not 5 days different than ours from one year to another. But you can start making splits normally where I live 1st of April and depend on being successful, and you can go to about the 2nd week of June. We usually have pretty good enough of a honey flow that you can be successful making splits at that time of year. You can make fall splits too if you have a fall flow. But when you don't have a flow, it's hard to make things work. Any kind of management that you do in a beehive is more difficult, and it'll make you question whether or not you're doing it right. You can do everything right and not be successful just because of outside influences. Weather and climate, drought, no bloom, all those things can have a big influence on whether or not you're successful. I do a fairly good job of raising queens. When I graft queens, when I take larvae out of the cell, put it into a cup, put it into a cell builder, I usually have 75 to 80% of the cups I graft will wind up being a queen cell at this time of year. But when you get into August, it goes down to about 30%. I'm not doing nothing different. Everything is the same. The bees just don't want to raise queen cells at that time of year. You have to really force them to do what you want to do. And all you guys know what it's like to try to make the woman in your life do what you want them to do. Bees are all females. When you try to make them do what you want them to do, they're going to put their hands on their hips and say, no, I'm going shopping. I'm not raising these queen cells. I'm doing something different. So understanding all these things helps you keep your sanity about this stuff and think that, well, it wasn't me. Walk-away splits are pretty easy. They work better when the bees are wanting to do it themselves. Raising your own queens, and most of the splits I make them with a queen cell. I make them with a queen cell that's 1 to 2 days old. It's not capped, it's a larva. But put one of those cells, say I graft, I take those out of the cell starter, and I put one of those cells between 2 frames of bees, and they finish the cell and make a queen. And 2/3 of the time, the queen comes back, everything works pretty good. The other 1/3 of the time, I look stupid. The queen don't come back, and sometimes by the time I realize she didn't come back, small hive beetles have, especially at this time of year. But that's just something you learn to deal with, learn to live with it. A mated queen, if you got to make a split later in the summer, use mated queens. That's your best chance for success. Just because you use a mated queen don't mean it's absolutely going to work late in the summer. Late July and August being the time of year I'm talking about. Comb, they always start better on drawn comb. Make sure they're healthy. make your splits using healthy brood. This goes into the treatment versus non-treatment of bees, of varroa. If you don't treat for varroa, you're going to have some issues that you'll recognize. Check the health of a hive looking at larvae. The larva should be brilliant white and curled up like this in the cell. If it's anything else, it's sick. It's done for. If it's curled up like this, but kind of off-white or yellowish, it's going to die. It's got a brood disease. That brood disease is vectored by varroa. Well, you can fix this brood disease. The later versions of that, the larva's lying lengthwise in the cell. First, it'll kind of look like a corkscrew, like it's trying to crawl out of the cell. Then it's lying lengthwise in the cell. Then it just kind of melts in the crease of the cell. And that's a type of foul brood that's associated with parasitic mites. It's similar to European foul brood. It's treatable. Terramycin will knock it out. It'll stop it in one treatment. Of course, you got to have a veterinarian's feed directive to get terramycin now, but that's not a big deal either. Call your veterinarian and tell him that you've got European foul brood. That's the magic, the magic words. See, veterinarians have this sheet of paper that says you can write a feed directive for these diseases in chickens, these diseases in cattle, these diseases in honeybees, and the disease listed in honeybees is European foul brood. So everybody else misidentifies it as European foul brood. You can just join the crowd. I got European foul brood, I need some terramycin. How much? Well, I need enough to treat all my hives. How many hives you got? A whole bunch of them. Good enough to treat your hive at least a couple of times. It's going to take about 4 tablespoons per hive to treat it completely, to get it healthy again. So if you're just not wanting to use any kind of antibiotics in your hive or chemicals, you can get the same result with powdered sugar. Sprinkle powdered sugar on every frame of open brood, just with a sifter. Every frame has got open brood on it. Sprinkle that powdered sugar on it. That kills that open brood. The bees will remove that. When they remove the host, they remove the pest. All 3 types of foul brood, American foul brood, European, and this parasitic mite, is caused by bacteria. The spores of this bacteria have to be ingested by a larva between 48 and 52 hours of age. Younger than that, and the lining of the midgut of the larva, the stomach lining of the larva, won't accept the spore embedding in it. Older than that, and the midgut lining is mature enough that it passes right through the system. So there's a 4-hour window that a larva has to ingest at least a dozen of these spores to contract foul brood. Well, if you remove all the eggs, all the larvae from the hive, which the bees will when you put the powdered sugar on it, the queen lays an egg, and it's 72 hours. It's 3 days before that egg hatches and becomes a larva. Well, that's already gone past the amount of time that this bacteria is going to live. Only American foul brood spores live longer than 24 hours. So if there's not an immediate host, European and parasitic mite foul brood spores die. So the powdered sugar will stop that part of the issue. It won't stop the vector of it. You got to knock down the varroa, and the bees themselves need to be fed something to clean their system out. Whatever you want to feed them. Some people use a lot of probiotics and claim that works. I don't know if it does or not. I know that terramycin does.
How do you apply terramycin?
Terramycin, you just take a tablespoon of it and sprinkle it across the end bars of the frames. Don't put it out in the middle of the brood nest, just across the end bars of the frames. In the process of the bees removing that, they have to ingest a little of it. And they ingest it and they feed that to that gets mixed in with the brood food that they give the larvae as they're feeding them. Plus they track it in the hive a little bit too. But it's 1 tablespoon across each set of end bars and 1 super. Just in that bottom super or bottom box where the bees are. That's how you treat with terramycin.
You do that twice or just once?
Just once for the parasitic mite. If it is truly European foul brood, there won't be any larvae any bigger than this. If I've seen 1 case of European foul brood in the last 3 years that was actually really European foul brood, there won't be any larvae that are any bigger than a C shape. There won't be any of them that are big enough to be trying to crawl out of the cell, which is actually what they're trying to do because they stop being fed. They're looking for food. They're trying to. These little larvae like this, their legs aren't developed enough that they can crawl. But a 5 and 6 day old larva, their legs are developed enough that they can try to crawl out of the cell. And that's what they're trying to do, but they run out of energy before they can ever get out of the cell. And they die in the cell, but they're usually lying lengthwise in the cell. But it's a larva. You can tell it's a larva because it don't have a head. It don't have body parts like a pupa. Sometimes you'll see pupa in an open cell where the bees have removed the capping off the cell and the pupa will be white. But you can tell it's a pupa because it's got a head. It's got body parts. You can see the eyes and the mandibles and everything, antenna. But right across the end bars is how you treat for this bacterial disease. When you see that, you know you've got varroa mites. So you may as well do something to knock down the varroa mites at the same time. But if you're not going to treat for varroa mites, you will have to do something for these secondary things. You're going to wind up treating for the symptoms. Even if the treatment is just powdered sugar, you're still going to wind up treating for the symptoms, doing something for that. And you're going to have to learn to divide your hives, to make 4 out of 1. You just got to do it. And that's not anything to be intimidated by. You guys can do that. I didn't just fall off a turnip truck, but I never worked for NASA either. I'm not some genius rocket scientist or anything. And dividing hives is just second nature. I've done it so much that we go to a bee yard and just split it. For commercial, I've worked for different commercial beekeepers before, and they call it nuking a yard. They go to the yard, they break everything down into all nukes. That's nuking a yard. And it's pretty awesome to see guys that are real professionals, to watch them do it. And it makes you feel just totally inadequate about everything after that. After you watch how fast they work through a bee yard, and you're thinking, man, I wish I could do that. But and these guys are old too. That's made even worse. They like cripple around out there. You think they need a walker, and then they get into those hives, and it's like, just give me 1. I'll do 1 while you're doing the other 4, or 5. But don't be intimidated to this. Jump in there and do it. The worst thing you can do is kill the bees, and they're going to die anyhow. So, that's the easiest way to get over your nervousness about it. Well, either you're going to die from your own devices, or I'll kill you. So, I'll make this split, and I'll dare you to live. You'll find that the meanest hives tend to live the longest, and that's just one of those Murphy's Law things. The hive that you wish would die never does, and they live just to pester you, seems like. But raising queens, it's not that big a deal. You can let them raise their own. You can make a walkway split. They'll raise their own queen. 2/3 of the time it'll work on average. Sometimes they'll all work, and you'll think that you got this whipped. And then the next time none of them will work, and you'll be despondent, and you'll be like my friend that freaks out, oh my gosh, I think I've killed all my bees. Well, you probably have. So, you know, I'll buy your used equipment at half price. But treatment versus non-treatment, I treat because I've got to have drones to raise queens. If you don't treat, it's hard to get drones to raise queens, to mate with the queens. Drones are more, they're more preferred by varroa mites to reproduce in drone-sized cells because of the trade-out. There's 5 to 1 trade-out in a drone cell. There's about a 1.5 to 2 to 1 in a worker cell, just because of that extra 3 days that a drone's a pupa. That extra 3 days is worth another 3 mites. To, you know, 1 female goes in, out of a drone cell, 5 come out. 5 mated females come out. And that's why drone cells are preferred by varroa mites. When you get tired of studying honeybees, study the things that kill honeybees. Study varroa mites. I absolutely despise varroa mites, but I've found that they are fascinating, just like honeybees. The female varroa mite knows that she's going into a drone cell because she a sense of smell. She knows that's a drone, that's a male bee. She's not going in there because the cell's bigger, she's going in there because she knows it's a drone. And their instinct is lay eggs in drone cells. If there's not any drone cells, lay eggs in worker cells. I've seen 1 queen cell one time that had a varroa in it. Once. So it don't happen much in queen cells just because they can't reproduce in a queen cell. A queen cell is only, see, the queen cell is only capped for about maybe 5 days, 4 to 5 days. The drone cell is capped from day 10 all the way to day 24. It's capped for 14 days. So that's that extra trade-off in varroa. And I got to where I couldn't get mated queens, good mated queens, because there weren't any drones. And what was happening were the bees that I was using were doing what I wanted them to do. They were removing the drone pupa that were infested with varroa, but that really didn't do me much good for getting a mated queen because all the drone pupas laying dead on the ground out in front of the hive, immature. So I had to start treating. If you decide you're going to treat, I would suggest start with the least toxic and move north. You know, the most important time to test for varroa is after you treat, to see if what you used worked. Make sure that what you use knocked down the population. Even if it's just powdered sugar or whatever you're using, whatever you're treating with, make sure it worked. And if it didn't work, move to the next level until you get something that kills the varroa. Any questions?
Is there any cure for American foul brood?
Fire and radiation. Extreme heat, pressure, and radiation will kill American foul brood spores. And extreme heat, I mean like
burn everything?
Well, to be safe. I mean, the old literature said, in fact, this is still the recommendation in Kentucky that they put out every year, is dig a hole 3 feet deep, put your bee equipment in it, and burn it, and then bury it. Bury the ashes. It's pretty extreme, I think, but I had a major battle with American foul brood several years ago. Once American foul brood gets into the feral population, it's likely to be 7 or 8 years before you stop seeing flare-ups, because the feral hive dies, your hives rob it out and bring it back to your hives, you have a flare-up. That hive dies, and before you find out that it's got American foul brood, it's been robbed by another feral hive. So American foul brood spores don't die in any amount of time that we recognize. mean, when I first started beekeeping, they said American foul brood spores will live at least 50 years because they had a sample that was 50 years old that the spores were still viable. Well, now that sample is 80 years old and they're still viable. Fire, burn it and be done with it.
Better safe than sorry.
Huh?
Better safe than sorry.
Exactly. You just don't want to, don't try to treat American foul brood. I mean, Thailand is supposed to take care of American foul brood. It suppresses it just like terramycin did. It don't kill it. When I first started beekeeping, the absolute stuff to use was sulfathiazine. That stuff would make you think that it killed it, but it would come back. It took it about 2 years, but it would come back. Terramycin would suppress it for about 12 weeks. Sulfa would suppress it for about 2 years. Thailand will suppress it for about a year. But it's going to come back. If you have that same brood gone, it will come back. The spores are just suppressed. When enough of the chemical has dissipated that the spore can reactivate, it will. So just don't mess with it. European, you can take care of that. Parasitic mites, you can take care of that, but not American. Any other questions?
What about the thermal treatment?
Thermal treatment's legitimate. I remember one of the first times I ever heard that term. Zachary Huang did part of his doctorate study on an apparatus that he had that went across the front of the hive. That he was trying to prove that a certain amount of heat would kill varroa mites, but would not kill bees. And he had a little apparatus that's about this big square and just across the front of the hive, and it would superheat the bees when they went through, coming into the front entrance, and it would knock the varroa mites off. I mean, just going and coming. And so it was not practical to use in his case because there's too many moving parts there for it to be practical for the average beekeeper. All he was doing it for was to get his doctorate, and he got it. And that was the first time. That was about 2003 or 4. It's the first time I ever saw anything like that. And this, the equipment that they have, built off that same principle. They built on that, and it's legitimate. It's not practical for somebody that has the number of hives that I do. You just have a few hives, though. It is a legitimate treatment, and it's non-chemical and fairly user-friendly. It just takes a while. It takes a while to do it, and you got to have a unit for each, or a pad for each hive. Any other questions? Everybody think you can make a split?
Do you make most of your splits in the nukes?
I make the big majority of my splits in the nuke boxes because the smaller area that the bees have to control the environment inside, the faster they'll start off. Even in hot weather, they'll start off quicker in a 5-frame nuke than they will in a 10-frame box.
And you just move them up to the 10 frame. And
Move them up to the 10 frame. I recommend people keeping a nuke for every colony that they have until you get like 40 or 50 colonies anyway.
Okay.
And then keep one for every 5. But just keep the nuke going all summer long. And as that nuke builds up, don't ever let it get built out to all 5 frames in the nuke. As it gets 4 full frames built into it, take 1 frame of capped brood out, because that's going to be adult bees quicker than the open brood. Take 1 frame of capped brood out and put it into a hive that needs some help. That will boost that hive within a week and a half. One deep frame full of capped brood. If it's a good solid frame full of capped brood, 1 deep frame is about 1/3 of a 3-pound package. So that's a lot of bees. 10,000 bees roughly that you're going to, I'm wrong, 5,000 bees. It's about 2,700 cells on the side. So you get about 5,000 bees out of one deep frame. That's still a pretty good boost to a hive that needs a little help. And put another frame in your nuke, preferably of drawn comb. But if it's not drawn comb, it's okay. And just keep it going all summer long. That way you've got a queen if you need her. You know, if a hive goes queenless middle of the summer, there you just plug that one into it. If a hive kind of goes under the radar and before you know it, this thing is going downhill fast, just put the whole nuke into it. If they don't have a queen, you know, if they're queenless, put the whole nuke into it. If the reason they're going downhill is a bad queen, smash the old one and put the nuke into it. And be ruthless about it.
Do you prefer the walk-away method?
For somebody that has never done this, I would suggest doing two things at the same time. With one hive, make a split using a mated queen, and with the other hive, make a walk-away. And judge for yourself which way you prefer to do. The walk-away is going to be behind the other one by about between 2 and 3 weeks, just because they've got to start from scratch. It's going to be 10 days at a minimum before they're going to have a queen in there. It's going to be another week before she starts laying any eggs. She's got to take a mating flight, come back, decide she wants to start laying eggs. So you're talking about 17, 18 days there before you're going to have a laying queen in your walkaway, the one that makes a queen. And as soon as they release this other queen, within a day or two, she'll be laying eggs in there. So you're a couple of weeks behind with a walkaway. Just, you know, keep that in mind when you're doing it. But I would suggest doing one of each or doing some of each just to see what you prefer to do, how you would rather do it. Where you live may be close to a low-lying area where there's a lot of dragonflies, and your walkaway may not be too good about getting a queen back in there. We lose some queens every year to dragonflies where I live, because there's several ponds right around my house where I have my main queen yard, and the dragonflies will just kind of hang out on top of the hives waiting on bees to come in. They very seldom try to catch a worker. They love to catch queens because they're big and awful easy to catch. We make a lot of sport out of killing dragonflies. A 22 caliber rifle with rat shot in it, and when you hit them, they just explode. Cool. Pretty cool. You gotta wait until they hover though. They're hard to hit when they're doing like that. But they always stop and hover, and you just follow them until they stop. We don't get to do that often, but when we do, it's a lot of fun. Satisfying. It's kind of the same satisfaction you get from hearing that crunch of a hive beetle under a hive tool. That's a very satisfying sound. But it's about time for this one to stop and the next one to start. And I'll be back at 4 o'clock. More questions and answers. If you want to come back, just think of something that you need an answer to, and I'll try to find somebody to answer it.
Thank you.